Welcome back to Cultural Psychology lecture. This lecture in Cultural Psychology is the first of two Module 4 lectures. In Module 4, we're covering chapters 11 and 12. There's some readings, including the chapters, and a few journal articles. And in this lecture, we'll be focusing on chapter 11. Again, the module itself is looking at culture, health, and mental health. We'll be looking in this lecture with a focus on culture and health. This photo that you see here is a photo I took about 8 years ago now in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. That's the capital of Cambodia. And this was at a high school, and you see some schoolgirls laughing and enjoying themselves on a beautiful day. And what might be interesting is that one of them is wearing a mask, and we're quite used to seeing people in masks today, but this was 8 years ago, well before the pandemic, and it demonstrates a cultural difference in something very simple about how we manage health in different places. When I was living in Japan and when I was living in Cambodia, well before COVID struck, you'd often see people masked, and typically they're masked for a couple of reasons, but mainly because they were feeling like they had a cold and they don't want to get other people sick. So it's very different about how we manage health ourselves, but you can see these global differences. I thought I'd bring that in. But generally, what does it mean to be healthy? We take our health for granted often, and we typically describe a healthy individual as someone who doesn't have a disease in any way, shape, or form. So that's kind of a medical model or a biomedical model when we think of health as just the absence of disease. But a biopsychosocial model, and you can see that word biology, psychology, and social are all combined into the biopsychosocial model, is not just the biological or medical aspect of not having any disease, but also taking psychological and social factors into account. I grabbed a couple pictures off the internet where you can see this biopsychosocial model sort of mapped out a little bit more. But health then is not just not having illness or genetic problem or disability of some sort, but it also involves our self-esteem, our personality, the economic status that we might hold, the relationships that we hold, and all of these play a large role in how we are healthy. You can see on the right another version of the same model that kind of takes into account mental health, but I suspect you can see, right, a more holistic view other than just physical health. Other more holistic views you might have heard of include things like maybe the yin and yang balance from China, or maybe the doshas from India. You know, we even hear about a balanced diet or a balanced lifestyle. So maintaining steady and stable functioning of our bodies is one aspect, but also considering our psychological and social view as well. Traditional medicine is defined by the World Health Organization, or WHO, as the sum total of the knowledge, skills, and practices based on the theories, beliefs, and experiences indigenous to different cultures. So traditional medicine often is thought of as something that's culturally based, but it's usually passed down from generation to generation, and it can be medicines or practices that are important. Oops, let me scroll back. So medical anthropology is a field of study that is closely related to the topics that we're discussing in this lecture. So medical anthropology is defined as an investigation of health and illness across cultures. I like to bring this up because when we compare health concepts and systems across cultures, when we do that in the field of anthropology, many people study this specifically. And so if you're interested in the topics that we're discussing in this lecture, you might want to take a class in medical anthropology. We do have a class in medical anthropology at USCB that you might be interested in. But the concepts of health can vary within cultures and between cultures, and each society has its own notion of what might be healthy or how we treat illness. This is a model that's pointed out in your textbook as the circle of wellness, which is a model from Native American traditions. So you can see here that it's much more on the biopsychosocial model, where they look at physical and mental health as well as emotional and social health, all combining to create this notion of the healthy spirit. So this is another picture that I took in downtown Phnom Penh about 6 years ago now, and every culture has different sort of ideas about how to treat illness, and this is an example of some women who were living on the street, and their idea of how to manage this individual had extreme headaches, and so the way to do that was to put these little squares of sticky tape on her head, and that was her understanding of that would be a healing tradition. The sticky tape had some sort of balm on it, but that's about it. And as you know, you probably wouldn't expect that that would cure headaches in America typically. So there's popular ideas of health, and these are popular healing methods seen on the streets of Phnom Penh. I was traveling that day with some folks who were bringing other medicines as options for these folks. It was quite an interesting day. Other traditional medicine that we see in Cambodia include moxibustion and coining. We can see that, I think I talked about that in another lecture. And also different kinds of fruits and vegetables might be used. This is a photo on the right of green, sort of not quite ripe in our understanding of mangoes, but green mangoes. And so green mangoes are often used to calm stomach aches. It's one of my favorite foods from Cambodia because it's kind of a tart, unripened mango. I love it because I don't have a fan for sweet. So even when I'm not sick, I really enjoy the green mango, but it's a great example of some traditional medicine as well. So there's a number of global indicators of health, and 4 are focused on in your textbook, and we'll talk about here in this lecture: life expectancy, infant mortality, subjective well-being, and obesity. I'll touch upon each of these. So let's start with talking about life expectancy. Life expectancy at birth is what we mean by how many years can we expect someone to live from the time they are born. So you can see this snippet of some life expectancy. I'm not sure which year this is from. You'll find slightly different numbers from different places, but you can see here that Switzerland, New Zealand, and Canada and the UK have a much longer life expectancy than someone who is born in Pakistan, but it's formally defined as the average number of years a person is expected to live from the time they are born. And I'm sure you're aware that life expectancy at birth for a child now is far longer than it was, well, say 100 years ago. And today we see life expectancy in our country, usually the numbers are somewhere between 76 and 82 years of age, compared to about 45 years of age in 1900. So what do you think the current life expectancy is today? Well, that's kind of interesting. Here's some data from the CDC in 2019 for the United States. So you could see that African Americans, their life expectancy was rated at 75.1 years. White Americans, however, had a life expectancy of 78.9 years, so more than 4 years longer than African Americans. Asian Americans fared even better. In 2019, it was expected, and then an Asian American would live to over 85 years of age. And finally, Hispanic Americans rang in at 81.2. So you can see these differences, cultural or racial and cultural differences, even within one country. Here's some interesting data. Let's take a look at this. In 2021, and this is actually data that was reported just last year, but the life expectancy dropped dramatically from 75 to 70-ish for African Americans. They lost 5 years in a 2-year span in their life expectancy. Same for whites, Asian Americans, and Hispanic. So you might know why this is, if you haven't guessed already. COVID and overdose deaths have sharply cut the U.S. life expectancy. I was just reading an article in Scientific American, and I found this chart in it that showed that dramatic drop for both men and women. And then I found this other chart in the same article that broke it up by Asian Americans, Hispanic, white, black, and finally Native American and Alaska Native Americans, who had the most significant drop in life expectancy. Again, we see some pretty interesting changes due to COVID, predominantly COVID, and also overdose deaths increasing. So we'll see how that goes over the next few years, but let's go back to a global picture. And this is just a chart that shows that life expectancy varies quite dramatically from different country to country. And you can see in the last 4 that are listed here are all in Africa. And then we've got Cambodia listed, but the highest life expectancy is often in places like Monaco, in Japan, and here I have another picture for you. You can find all these pictures in different places, and you can look at different charts, but Singapore and Japan do quite well, Monaco and other places. So turning to, let me just go back for a quick minute. You know, the reasons for this, of course, is differences in wealth and resources in a country that are going to affect life expectancy. And so you can explore life expectancy rates across different countries. Infant mortality rates also vary quite dramatically. Infant mortality is defined by the number of infant deaths per 1,000 live births. And you can see this particular chart that I found. You can see on the right side, of course, Monaco and Japan have very low infant mortality rates, but places like Afghanistan or Nigeria have quite high infant mortality rates. It's interesting that the infant mortality rates in the United States are among the highest in comparison to other industrialized countries. And you might not be surprised that disparities exist among different racial groups in our country. This is a picture from 2021 that shows these infant mortality rates varying by country to country. You can see these, you can find these clickable maps online if you'd like to learn more. Turning to subjective well-being as another global indicator of health, right? By subjective well-being, we mean how happy are people? How are people faring in their day-to-day lives? And one of my favorite stories around subjective well-being is about the country of Bhutan, who since 1972 has been rating the happiness levels of all the occupants of Bhutan, when the king of Bhutan at the time declared that gross national happiness is probably more important than gross domestic product. I just love that. But when it comes to subjective well-being, you can also find clickable maps that look at the global view, of course, of how people are faring in terms of how happy they are. And in this picture, you can see Australia, United States have much more high ratings on subjective well-being than much of the continent of Africa and some other places. If you look in Europe, at Northern Europe, there in the Scandinavian countries, they often find that they have the highest rates of subjective well-being. I think I have one more. So you can see in this chart that Denmark often gets the highest rating, and so they are often proudly saying that they're the happiest nation in the world, although Norway sometimes gets that rating, and Switzerland, Iceland, and all those, Finland, kind of vie for these the happiest nations on earth. And finally, the culture and obesity, of course, is not surprising that obesity is a public health concern across many countries, and the differences across cultures in food choice, in behaviors, and lifestyle contribute to differences in weight and differences in obesity rates across different countries. Obesity is usually defined as having a body mass index, or BMI, at or above 30. Overweight is usually a BMI at or above 25, but that's quite controversial and varies. But people are often surprised to learn that the United States has the highest rate of obesity. And the causes for this are not typically surprising. It's linked to consumption of fast food and soft drinks, and also a lack of exercise. So you can see the rates here. So body weight standards and dissatisfaction with body weight are highly linked to socioeconomic status. And this can be seen quite interestingly when you look at the fact that when you're in a country with very low amounts of money, low socioeconomic standards, those countries that have the least amount of money, people prefer heavier figures. They actually find that overweight figures are preferred. On the other hand, those countries that have a lot of money, people prefer thinner bodies. So our cultural values, our beliefs, and our opinions about wealth and beauty and power impact our attitudes towards eating, our attitudes towards thinness, and our attitudes towards obesity. So these cultural values and beliefs and opinions, right, are linked probably quite strongly to consumer culture. So we see, for example, that food advertising on children's TV, about 73% of the ads are for fast food or convenience foods on children's television. So we learn at a young age what we might want, and it's linked strongly to our weight. Quick focus that I like to point out is on diet. And the healthiest diets in the world include the Japanese diet, a diet that's rich in fish, rich in tofu and vegetables, and they tend to eat very much smaller portions than we do in America, and they're rich, the food is rich, energy rich, but small portions. And you see that Japan has a much greater overall life expectancy, lower rates of dementia, diabetes, and heart disease and cancers as well. So we link that to diet. And you also might have heard of the Mediterranean diet, also linked to greater health. And the Mediterranean diet involves natural and unprocessed foods like many fruits and vegetables and whole grains and nuts, in other words, plant-based foods, with olive oil as the primary source of dietary fat, little consumption of red meat, but moderate amounts of fish and white meat, and even moderate amounts of wine with meals. And these diets are leading to healthier outcomes. There's an activity that's presented that you can look at in the module that is about the Nihon Sun study. The Nihon Sun study is a study of they took a look at 3 different groups of Japanese who were in Japan, and Japanese who were living in Hawaii, and Japanese Americans, and looked at the impact of these three different groups on their heart rates and their heart disease. And so you'll find that it really brings together some of these topics that we're looking at. So I urge you to take a look at that Nihon-san study. Finishing up our topics in this, the death around the world sounds like a hard thing to talk about, right? People find it hard to talk about death, particularly in America. But culture clearly shapes how we experience death. So whether we're celebrating death or mourning, a little bit of both, but end of life is commemorated quite differently. On the picture here is a picture, I did not take this picture, I found it on the internet, but this is a picture of a funeral in Cambodia. And this is in the front of someone's house. They put up this great sort of tent, and they will bring out the tables and serve food to relatives and friends who drop by for an entire day or maybe a couple of days in the celebration of life when someone has died. And, you know, Indonesia has a sort of a celebration and caring for the deceased that's quite different than what we experience. Other places like the Philippines will dress the deceased in very fine, elaborate clothing. Australian Aborigines celebrate the dead by painting their bones after they've decomposed. And today we're even experiencing sort of this environmental consciousness around funerals, even in our area. So because embalming and concrete vaults are not necessarily environmentally friendly, people are finding other ways to bury folks, such as with woven willow caskets, or making the burned ashes into artificial reefs for the fish to live in. So there's lots of different ways that we can experience death around the world. One of my students a year ago created a lovely painting that represented 6 different death rituals around the world, and this was actually her essay assignment. In this case, this painting was part of it, and then she wrote up about what she learned about these different death rituals around the world. So this might be give you an idea of the kinds of things that might be an essay project, your final project in the class. There's some other videos that are linked that I urge you to watch. I especially think that there's a couple of interesting ones around Michelle's story and the social determinants of health. But just to kind of finish up this lecture, this is a picture from your textbook that kind of takes in the model of cultural influences on health, but culture influences, you know, the institutions around us, what we have for support in terms of what support we can have in healthcare or even sanitation, but also individually, you know, our lifestyle and behavior and social support. Our climate plays a role as well, as we've seen in COVID, but these are all together, you know, going to bring in how healthy or diseased we might find ourselves. So I'll leave this lecture with a quote for the day, and that's from the 4th King of Bhutan. Gross national happiness is maybe more important than gross domestic product. That finishes up this lecture on culture and health. The next lecture will be on culture and mental health.